They took you, but they could never erase you. My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and I lead Burkina Faso. But today, I do not speak as a president. I speak as your brother, you, whose names were severed, whose gods were banned, whose brilliance was bent into other men's empires. You, who crossed oceans, not by choice, but by chains. For 400 years, they built walls between us, between your pain and our memory, between your triumphs and our soil. But I am here to tell you, the silence was never consent. We remembered, we waited. And now, a door long locked is opening again. Not for pity, not for charity, but for power, real power. I will speak to you of secret meetings, of phone calls that rewrote maps, of a vision they fear too much to name. A global black renaissance. Stay with me. This is not nostalgia. It is sovereignty, rediscovered. Subscribe and walk with us through the fire of forgetting into the light of return. It began one night in Ouagadougou, a restless leader, a flickering screen, and a voice across the ocean that cracked the sky. It was 3 in the morning in Ouagadougou. I could not sleep. My country was under siege, from poverty, from terrorism, from the long shadow of colonial control, the kind of weight that sits on a leader's chest and never quite lifts. In that restless hour, I opened my laptop, not for strategy, not for news, just to feel something. I found myself watching videos from America, streets flooded with people, raised fists, tears, rage, fire. Names like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor echoed through the speakers. Names I had never known, but somehow had always known. And then it struck me, like thunder splitting a dry season sky. I was not looking at a foreign struggle. I was looking at myself. I was looking at my soldiers resisting foreign occupation. I was looking at my young people who refuse to accept that poverty is our fate. The fire burning in Minneapolis was the same fire burning in Ouagadougou. That night, I called my grandmother. She is 89 years old, the keeper of our family's oral history. I told her what I had seen. Then I asked something I had never dared to ask. "Grandmother," I said, "when our people were taken across the ocean, did we ever stop believing they were still our family?" There was silence. For so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then she spoke. "Ibrahim," she said, "for 400 years, African mothers have looked at the stars and wondered if their stolen children were looking at the same stars. Every harvest season, we set aside food for family who might never return. Every celebration, we sing songs for voices we no longer hear, but never forget." And then she said something that made me weep. "We never stopped waiting for you to remember who you are." That was the moment everything changed. The moment I realized this separation between continental Africans and African Americans was not natural. It was engineered, maintained, enforced by those who knew that our unity would threaten their grip on power. 6 months after that phone call, I received a letter that shook me to my core. It came from Dr. Aisha Williams, a professor of African Studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C. But this was not academic correspondence. It was a cry from a daughter to her ancestral home. She had traced her lineage through DNA tests, oral histories, and historical records. She found her roots in the Mossi Kingdom right here in Burkina Faso. She had identified her ancestral village. She even found names of relatives lost to the archives of slavery. But what broke my heart was this. "Mr. President," she wrote, "I know where I come from now, but I do not know how to come home. I do not know if there is a place for me in the land of my ancestors." I read her letter 17 times. Each time, shame gripped me. Shame that this brilliant woman, this daughter of our soil, felt like a stranger in her own homeland. Shame that centuries of separation had convinced our family they no longer belonged. That night, I did something unprecedented. I called Howard University. I asked to speak with Dr. Williams. When she answered, I said, "Dr. Williams, this is Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. I received your letter, and I have something to tell you. You are not a stranger here. You are a daughter returning home, and we have been waiting for you. We spoke for 3 hours. She told me what it meant to be black in America. The exhaustion of being exceptional just to be accepted. The loneliness of rooms where her brilliance was questioned before it was seen. But then she said something that gave me hope. When I found my African roots, she said, I felt whole. For the first time, I knew I was more than what America told me I was. I belonged to a story that began before slavery and will continue after its wounds are healed. That was the moment the idea was born. Quietly, humbly, boldly. A reunion, not symbolic, not ceremonial. A strategic, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual reconnection between the continent and its scattered kin. This would not be led by politicians. It would not be filtered through foreign NGOs. It would be personal, real, revolutionary, and it began with one call, one letter, one truth spoken out loud. We are still family. But what happens when family remembers itself? That was only the beginning. What followed was not a press release. It was not a policy proposal. It was a whisper that became a wave. I called it the reunion, not through government channels, not on national television, but from one phone call to the next. I began reaching out to African Americans who had succeeded in fields the world told us were not for people like us. Technology, medicine, education, finance, the arts. I did not reach out as a politician looking for votes. I reached out as a family member longing to reconnect. The first to respond was Marcus Johnson, a software engineer from Oakland, California. He had been following our Pan-African reforms. When I contacted him directly, he told me later he thought it was a prank. African presidents don't call random black engineers. He laughed, but I told him he was not random. His great-grandmother was born in West Africa before being dragged across the ocean. His brilliance in Silicon Valley was not separate from our own. It was a continuation, a reflection of who we had always been. Despite everything, Marcus agreed to visit, not as a tourist, but as a returning son. On his first day, I introduced him to our tech team. Young Burkinabe minds building solutions from scratch. Marcus expected to teach. Instead, he was challenged, inspired, changed. By the end of the week, he wasn't just visiting Africa. He was investing in it, not with charity, not with pity, but with partnership. He co-founded a fintech company with our local engineers, building financial tools for underserved African communities and the diaspora. But more than the business, what transformed Marcus was something deeper. He said to me, for the first time, I wasn't the token black hire. I was just a professional. Among other black professionals, I felt normal, truly normal. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just about investment. It was about healing. It was about returning people to a state of dignity that systems had stolen from them. Then came another voice. Dr. Michael Thompson, a top cardiovascular surgeon from Chicago. I've spent my career proving black excellence in medicine, he told me. But I've never had the chance to simply be excellent without proving it first. We spoke for 4 hours about African-built medical schools, about hospitals rooted in cultural competence, about bringing African-American doctors not as volunteers, but as visionaries. By the end of our call, he committed 6 months to Burkina Faso and promised to bring others. That promise became a spark. Dr. Thompson introduced me to Dr. Keisha Williams, a renewable energy engineer tired of American red tape. She introduced me to Robert Jackson, a financial analyst who saw the liberation of Africa as inseparable from the economic freedom of Black America. Robert connected me to Angela Davis Brown, an educational visionary whose methods had transformed outcomes for Black students in U.S. public schools. Each link in the chain led to another. These were not people running from America. They were grateful for what they had built, but they were also ready to build more. Something beyond personal achievement. As Dr. Williams said, in America, change crawls. In Africa, we can build from the ground up. That was the moment I realized we were no longer making connections. We were forming a brain trust, a global alliance of Black brilliance. 6 months after that call with Dr. Thompson, I made a decision that could have ended my presidency. I hosted a private summit, a virtual meeting of 50 of the most accomplished African Americans I had connected with. I opened with one sentence. My brothers and sisters, I believe we are living through a moment that only comes once every 500 years. Then I showed them a vision, an Africa that processes its own resources, that manufactures its own goods, that designs its own technology, not as a dream, but as a strategy. But I also told them this dream was impossible without them, without their skills, their networks, their courage. I told them, we do not need your money. We need your minds. The response overwhelmed me. Marcus Johnson announced his permanent relocation to Burkina Faso to help build a new tech sector. Dr. Thompson committed to founding a new medical school. In partnership with 3 African universities, Dr. Williams laid out a blueprint for renewable energy across West Africa, powered by African American engineering. Robert Jackson presented a financial model to bypass traditional aid systems and create mutual wealth. But it was Angela Davis Brown who said something I will never forget. She stood with tears in her eyes and said, I've spent my career trying to fix schools that were never meant for our children. What if we stopped fixing and started building? What if we created models in Africa that could be exported back to America? What if we stopped being defensive about Black potential and started being offensive about Black excellence? That meeting was supposed to last 2 hours. It went on for 8. By the end, we had $75 million in committed investment, projects spanning 7 African nations, and a movement that could no longer be hidden. But power, real power, does not go unnoticed. And soon, the world began to react. What began as a whisper soon became a current. The ripple of return began to spread. Quietly, steadily, undeniably. Marcus Johnson's fintech platform, once an idea on a whiteboard, had grown to serve 25,000 users across 6 African nations within just 4 months. Not through international aid, not through government subsidies, but through relevance, through understanding the needs of African communities and building with them, not for them. Transactions that had once required hours in queues were now completed in seconds. Small businesses that had been invisible to traditional banks were now gaining access to microcredit through decentralized systems built by their own people. Meanwhile, Dr. Michael Thompson's initiative to train the next generation of African doctors had drawn over 500 applications from African American medical professionals. They were not coming as volunteers on short-term missions. They were coming to stay, to teach, to learn, and to reconnect. Many brought not only their knowledge, but also their stories of struggle, of resilience, of being doubted and overlooked. In Africa, they found a different kind of stage, not one where they had to perform to prove their value, but one where their value was presumed, where excellence was expected, not exceptional. Dr. Keisha Williams's renewable energy project was generating clean, reliable power in rural communities that had never seen electric light without the hum of diesel generators. Solar fields were springing up in places long forgotten by national grids. Local engineers were being trained. Women were leading installations. Children were doing homework under LED lanterns instead of flickering candlelight. Elders began charging phones to connect with family for the first time in years. In village after village, the glow of light became the glow of dignity. And across all of this, beneath the data and the press releases, something deeper was happening, something harder to measure, but impossible to ignore. A shift in posture, a quiet rising. For the first time in generations, people of African descent on both sides of the Atlantic were no longer approaching each other as strangers, or saviors, or symbols. They were approaching each other as family. One afternoon, I received a message from a young woman named Kesha Robinson. She was 32 years old, a successful marketing executive from Atlanta. She had come to Burkina Faso to explore possibilities for creative collaboration. On her last day, she asked to meet me privately. President Traore, she said, I need to tell you something that might sound strange. I listened. She continued, in 5 days here, I felt something I have never felt in 32 years of being Black in America. I felt normal. I asked her to explain. She looked at me, eyes brimming, and said, I didn't have to code switch. I didn't have to wonder if I was being too much in a meeting. I didn't have to shrink to be safe. I just was. I was whole. I felt like I could breathe without apologizing. Her words stayed with me, because what we were building was not just infrastructure. It was healing. Not just investment, but identity. In Burkina Faso, university students formed Diaspora mentorship clubs. In Senegal, young entrepreneurs pitched co-founded ventures with African Americans. In Côte d'Ivoire, the Reunion message was translated into local dialects and broadcast by community radio. No law mandated it. No agency funded it. It was organic, viral, real. And yet, as the momentum grew, so too did the murmurings. Questions began to circulate. Quiet at first, then louder. Was this movement political? Was it coordinated? Who was behind it? Whose interests might it threaten? Foreign embassies began requesting briefings. Development banks asked for clarifications. Even certain domestic figures started to express discomfort. Not because of what we were doing, but because of how quickly it was gaining traction. But in the streets of Bogo-Dioulasso, in the corridors of the University of Ouagadougou, in the informal markets and the tech hubs, the energy was unmistakable. It was not chaos. It was confidence. For decades, we had waited for permission to grow, for assistance that often came with conditions, for opportunities that too often meant compromise. But now, we were choosing to partner with people who saw us not as a project, but as peers, choosing to work with minds that remembered what it meant to build without apology. One international journalist, struggling to frame the story, published a piece titled, Ibrahim Traoré's Pan-African Gambit, Symbolism or Substance. I smiled when I saw it, because while headlines debated, systems were shifting. While analysts speculated, results were visible. And while others questioned our motives, our people simply searched. They typed into their browsers a phrase that began trending not as gossip, but as curiosity. Ibrahim Traoré news. Not scandal, not spectacle, but substance. People were looking not for slogans, but for evidence. And what they found was not perfect, but it was real. It was ours. And it was only just beginning. What happens when people who were never meant to connect begin to build together? Without permission, eyes begin to turn. Quiet meetings are held. Old agreements are revisited. It started subtly. A delayed development loan, a canceled meeting, an unexpected request for clarification from an embassy that had not previously shown interest. Then came the polite inquiries, cloaked in diplomatic language, but heavy with concern. We'd like to better understand the scope of your recent transatlantic engagements. Are these collaborations reflective of official policy? The tone was respectful. The subtext was not. Soon after, an ambassador requested an urgent meeting. The conversation began with pleasantries. It ended with a warning. President Traoré, he said, you are young, charismatic, full of potential, but some decisions, made too quickly, can complicate long-term stability. I asked him to clarify. He smiled. Africa, he said, requires steady hands, predictable partnerships, trusted friends. Then, without naming names, he referenced a leader from our history, a leader who had also spoken of independence, of dignity, of Pan-African unity. You remember what happened to him, he said. I did. But what he did not understand was this. We were not repeating the past. We were reimagining the future. The movements of African Americans reconnecting with the continent did not go unnoticed in their home country either. Some of the professionals who had publicly embraced our partnership began experiencing increased scrutiny. One was asked by her employer whether her time in Africa could present a conflict of interest. Another found his business deals slowed down without clear explanation. A third received calls from journalists who seemed more interested in questioning her loyalties than her work. None of this was stated openly, but the message was clear. The line between curiosity and caution had been crossed. And yet, despite this, something else began to shift. Quietly, beneath the surface, delegations from Brazil, from the Caribbean, from African-descended communities in Europe, began reaching out. They were not asking for aid. They were asking for inclusion, for partnership, for blueprints. Inquiries came from historically black colleges in the United States, from faith leaders, from student groups who saw in the reunion not a threat, but a spark. Not a rejection of America, but a redefinition of identity that could embrace both roots and branches. No international declaration was issued. No treaty was signed. But something irreversible had begun. A message that crossed borders without passports. A memory awakened in multiple tongues. And behind every official response, curious, cautious, or critical, was a simple question that no one dared ask aloud. What if they succeed? We are not naive. We know what we are building will not go unchallenged. Systems of extraction do not dismantle themselves. Narratives that cast Africa as dependent are not eager to be rewritten. The road ahead will not be paved with applause. It will be rough, contested, sometimes lonely, but it will be ours. And that is what makes all the difference. In the coming months, we move from idea to infrastructure, from possibility to permanence. Joint ventures formed over phone calls are becoming registered companies. Educational programs born from reunion meetings are becoming accredited institutions. Medical partnerships are being embedded in national health strategies. We are building not just momentum, but memory. A new story, written in real time, by hands that once had no pen. In Kenya, a coalition of Diaspora investors is co-financing the construction of a bioengineering hub in Kisumu. In Ghana, curriculum is being redesigned to include African American thinkers, not as guests in our history, but as protagonists in our future. In Senegal, Diaspora-led fashion houses are merging traditional textile with global innovation, creating brands that speak both heritage and aspiration. And in Burkina Faso, the reunion is now being taught in schools, not as a political doctrine, but as a civic movement rooted in family, dignity, and shared destiny. The idea is no longer fragile. It is becoming foundational. We are not simply reacting to global pressures. We are defining our own axis. For decades, African countries have spoken of self-reliance while trapped in cycles of external dependency. Now, through this union of minds across oceans, we are proving that self-reliance does not mean isolation. It means choosing your partners, choosing your path, choosing your values. But let us be honest, this new way of building will attract resistance, not always in the form of sanctions or statements, but in subtler ways. Loans delayed, meetings postponed, partnerships suddenly re-evaluated. Yet our strength lies in clarity. We are not asking for permission. We are not waiting for rescue. We are planting what we intend to harvest, and the roots are already taking hold. Across social media, across boardrooms, across classrooms, the reunion is shifting how young Africans and their diaspora siblings view themselves and each other. They are speaking a new language of cooperation, a new grammar of belonging. They are no longer asking who abandoned whom, but what can we now build together? They are beginning to understand that the real power was never in being accepted by others, but in recognizing one another. And perhaps that is the most revolutionary act of all. To choose connection over resentment, creation over complaint, unity over nostalgia. The Atlantic scattered us, but it did not separate us. And every step we now take, from Detroit to Dakar, from Baltimore to Bobo Dioulasso, is a step toward a future that only we can author. Together. 400 years of silence did not erase us. Oceans could scatter us, but they could not sever us. Chains could confine us, but they could not contain our memory. And now, what was once broken is being bound again. This is not charity. This is not pity. This is sovereignty rediscovered. The reunion is not a headline. It is a harvest of dignity, of knowledge, of belonging. Across Africa, new institutions are rising. Across America, New questions are stirring. What if we are not two stories, but one unfinished chapter? What if the brilliance of a people, once divided, can now converge to shape the balance of the 21st century? We have proven that it is possible. We have shown that it is powerful. But inevitability still requires courage. The door has opened wider than it has been in centuries. The question is, who will walk through it? To every African American who wonders if Africa has a place for you, know this: your seat has been waiting for 400 years. To every African who wonders if your brothers and sisters abroad still remember, know this: they are searching. Type Ibrahim Traoré news, and you will see not just speeches, but seeds. Seeds of connection, of enterprise, of futures being built. We are no longer waiting for others to define our worth. We are defining it together. The next chapter will not be written by institutions alone. It will be written by families, by partnerships, by bridges strong enough to carry generations. And when history looks back, it will not see a continent begging for aid. It will see a family that remembered itself. That is the revolution. That is the promise. And to each of you listening, the invitation remains. Do not just watch. Participate. Share this message. Carry it to every corner of our scattered family. Because this reunion is bigger than any one leader, bigger than any one nation. It is ours. And when the world searches again for Ibrahim Traoré news, let them not only find words, but witness a movement that refused to forget, and a future that refused to be denied.